Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kjaer. In this WorldCanvass series, we're talking about the phenomenon of cultural memory, or collective memory, and investigating ways in which groups narrate their own histories. We'll be taking a moment with historian Lisa Heineman, and we'll be focusing on the Third Reich and the Holocaust, examining cultural memory through competing narratives and seeing how various groups commemorate the events and tragedies of that time. Lisa Heineman is a professor of history at the University of Iowa, and I want to thank you for being here, Lisa. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you've heard the earlier discussions about cultural memory and commemoration. How do we begin to understand cultural memory in respect to something as grand and sort of incredible, really, as the history of the Third Reich and the Holocaust?
It's a huge subject, and probably the most difficult thing to grapple with is, in a way, how many moving parts there are. The Second World War and the Holocaust, in particular, took place over an enormous geographic space. They affected directly and indirectly an enormous number of countries. Each country had its own positioning. There were aggressors, there were collaborationist states, there were states that were militarily invaded, there were states that had large numbers of certain victim groups, such as Jews. There were states that had multiple different victim groups. That's moving part number one. It's just the number of different places that are involved in the event itself. Memory, of course, memory starts during the event, but memory really happens especially and develops after the event. So the post-World War II setting is very important too. And here, again, there are a lot of moving parts. After the Second World War, Europe is divided by the Cold War. Eastern Europe, communist states, and Western Europe, more liberal democratic states, have different kind of imperatives and different agendas in commemorating World War II and the Holocaust, in remembering the events of Nazi Germany. That's number two. Then things change over time. Of course, the decades go by, the Cold War ends. Events in other parts of the world matter a great deal. The State of Israel is formed in 1948. It starts out as a very small, tenuous state, eventually becomes a regional superpower, and that has an enormous impact on what memory of the Holocaust is going to mean to the Middle East. There are a varying cast of characters here in the immediate post-World War II period. You have a lot of survivors, a lot of people who are direct perpetrators, very much around, very active in society, in some places living still in very close quarters, neck to neck with each other. So that's one environment for memory. A few decades later, the culture is determined more by their own children, or more generally, the children's generation. New voices come into play, not necessarily just generational, but for example, in the early decades after World War II, there was very little said about the Nazi persecution of homosexuals, because it was dangerous to be out of the closet. Same-sex activity still illegal in most places in the 1950s. You eventually, several decades later, get the gay liberation movement, and that then brings about a whole new area of commemoration, commemorating the persecution of homosexuals. There are different locations of commemoration, not just geographic locations, but sort of fields of commemoration. There's building museums, there's building monuments, there's literature and film. There's family stories, much more informal stuff going on. There's legislation, right? States pass laws to maybe financially compensate victims of persecution, or to financially compensate war veterans, some of whom may have been perpetrators. There's changing aesthetics, right? If you're thinking about, let's say, a single genre such as film or literature, the aesthetics of the 1950s are very different than the aesthetics of the early 21st century. So there's an awful lot going on. It's a very fascinating field of study, and has provided real ground for thought, not just about those historical events, but also has helped us to think about how to think about memory more generally, and often provided very interesting sort of models that have been useful to people thinking about memory in other contexts as well.
Well, if we were to think about, take it from the state perspective for just a moment, it seems to me that there are probably few national, states that documented things as well as the Nazis did, had a propaganda machine, thinking back into the 40s. At that time, their propaganda machine, creating the stories they wanted to have told, keeping track of everything, but still trying to make sure that they told various publics certain kinds of things. I mean, it seems not to have been accidental. It seems to be very purposeful, and there were certain elements, I imagine, of what was actually happening that leadership would have preferred stay out of any kind of collective memory, or they perhaps would shape it in a way so that something that looked like one thing became something else in the description of the state. What do we say about that when Nazism is defeated? We're now in a new era after 1945. Obviously, Germans have to come to terms with whatever their own personal and familial involvements may have been, or whatever they felt about their own nation during that prior 12 or 15-year period. But there was sort of the official story during the Nazi reign, and then many things have to be, dismantled. Many thoughts need to be dismembered, dismantled, and people begin to learn a different kind of truth.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, the Nazi government was very aware of itself in history, and very aware that later on people would be writing its histories. Of course, they were hoping that they'd be in a position to write their own histories and to sort of maintain control of memory in a way. But you lose a war, you sort of lose that control. But there's a very famous speech by Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the policing system, including the SS, which was possibly the single most important institution in the genocide, particularly in Eastern Europe. And this is a very famous speech where he's talking to the SS elite and saying in so many words, this is a chapter of history that will never be written, but we know how important this task is. We know that that is the genocide against the Jews. We know that this must be done, and we know that we're doing this right and important thing, but it will never be written. So they're very aware of, in a sense, what they understand as the importance of their historical legacy, but also that it's going to be a tricky legacy. And of course, realize he's saying that in an environment in which he thinks they're going to win. Never mind what happens when they start realizing they're not going to win. And of course, towards the end of the war, there's an enormous destruction of records, razing of the sites of the death camps, for example, with the military retreat. Sites get completely razed. Files get burned, files get, they don't get sent to the shredder, they get burned. That's what they did at the time. So there's an enormous destruction of records in an attempt to control what's accessible. With the development of memory, of course, happens in a sense, in a very kind of a breakneck way, because it's happening during the last stages of the war. From both Eastern Europe, the Soviets, and then Western Europe, really the British and the Americans, are coming in, and even during the war, they're engaged in discovering things that they hadn't expected to see. The Soviets liberate Auschwitz, the British liberate Bergen-Belsen. Every country has its moment of liberating a concentration camp or a death camp that becomes part of its memory of its activity in liberation. But this is while this war is still on. And it's not at all clear that the final stages of the war are going to be easy or without enormous human cost. So in the midst of these last stages of the war, there's already a kind of a, how can we document, what is the importance of documenting what we're seeing as we go into camps. At the same time, the people doing this work aren't sitting in libraries. They're not sitting in comfortable circumstances at all. They're fighting a war. They themselves are in a very difficult circumstance, and the emotional impact to them of first setting foot in these places is enormous. So they're doing it also under an enormous sort of personal strain. As time goes on, of course, the allies, the occupying allies across Germany, the Soviets in the East and the British and the Americans and the French in the West, try to shape memory. And part of that is they're trying to educate Germans to whatever they're hoping they'll be in the post-war world, in something that's going to work out. There are tensions between the Soviets and the Western Allies, but it's not 100% clear what direction the Cold War is going to take. So again, there's a lot that's in flux. But on both sides, the military occupation is initially very important in trying to shape memory, trying to make sure the German civilians and demobilized German military personnel are getting certain messages. And they're trying to disseminate memory back home. For the Soviets, for example, the business of having defeated fascism and the incredible military might of Nazi Germany, this was a big struggle for the Soviets, enormous human costs. And it was very important in post-war Soviet Union to remember this great victory. It was politically important in sort of helping to prop up Stalin. I mean, it's a kind of an instrumental use politically, but also a very deep personal importance to Soviet citizens who had lost enormous amounts. So this business of creating memories in locations where the history hadn't necessarily actually happened. Americans create memories of a war that didn't happen on their own territory. That has to do with a sort of an importation. Memories get imported, exported to to mandate Palestine and then the state of Israel. So indeed, there's a lot going on with a number of characters involved here, and then the geopolitics of the post-World War II era.
Well, and as you know, in other segments of this program, we've been talking about remembering and forgetting. There's the remembering, and then there's the stuff that you forget. And Jeff Porter made a point in a piece he wrote for the paper about tonight's topic that if we could remember every single detail, and the poor people who are savants who do in fact recall every single thing that ever happened in their lives, and you kind of just can't handle it all. There is maybe a conscious choice sometimes we make, and an unconscious choice perhaps, to let some things go and to keep other things close. I think most of us are familiar that many Jews will say, you know, we must never forget. This could happen again if we ever forget what happened, you know. So never forget the terror, the tragedy, the fact that we have to stand up against this kind of brutality. But in order to live one's life, there are things you need to set aside and try to look forward. You have talked to many people who lived through this era, and your research has touched on a lot of personal stories. Could you give us a little insight into how people move ahead from something as terrible as this?
You know, there have been enormous projects to collect documentation of both survivors and, you know, people who fall into the class, survivors and perpetrators and bystanders. Enormous oral history projects. We have so many interviews, videotaped and audio interviews, and not surprisingly, people have very different personal strategies for dealing with this. So if we stay with let's say, survivors, either racial or political persecutees, or people persecuted on account of sexual orientation, or any of the other categories, but certainly Jewish survivors, there's an enormous documentation of that. And there's a range of sort of personal responses that people have to how do I integrate this experience yet go on with my life. One important response is to refuse to get into the whole interviewing business. Many survivors say, no, I don't want to do that. Let somebody else do it. I don't want to. My strategy is not to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean they're not talking about it at all. They might be talking about it with their families. But they might not want to be part of somehow this collective project, particularly as they see in some cases, some survivors might be, you know, troubled by the way a particular oral history project is maybe taking a certain direction, or, you know, some survivors are troubled by what seems sometimes to be a kind of a politicization of their experience, for getting involved in other contemporary debates. Some survivors feel that's very useful. They want their experience to be recorded and remembered and made relevant to something that maybe hadn't even existed in the 1940s. So people have very different personal responses to how to balance that. Certainly, one early kind of response was to think in much more close, narrow terms. What do we want to tell our children? You know, they're not necessarily thinking about big oral history projects or the recording of history, but the first question is, what do we want to tell our children? Okay, and that's in many ways the first thing that people would have to confront. Exactly the same thing we might say on the perpetrator side, right? And again, you talked earlier about sort of Germans having to come to terms with their past, and of course they're largely the perpetrator population. What are they going to tell their kids about what they were doing in the war? That's a very difficult personal decision, and that's where it starts before we even get to these kinds of larger social issues.
Yeah, because one could imagine a country, the newly formed democratic Germany, you know, saying, you know, making a statement, a sorrowful statement about what had happened, and, you know, we're a different country, we're moving toward a different future, and so on. But what did you do during the war? When that comes from a grandchild or from a child, it's a different kind of question. It takes a different kind of response.
Yes.
When we think about the idea of commemoration, you mentioned memorials and museums, and we know that these exist. Could you give some examples of how some of the most affected countries during that period are looking now? What is it, next year's? How many years is that? After 1945, we're 60 years after the end of the war. And are there yearly commemorations of the end of World War II in Europe, for example?
Yes, there are. You know, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. You know, in some locations in the Soviet Union and in Russia, there's a march every year on the day. It's a very important activity, important commemorative moment. Museums in different places have taken very different approaches to this, as you can imagine, throughout history, because museums are, first of all, responsible to speaking to their local populations. But they're also constrained by political pressures. And a wonderful example of this is what happens in post-war Germany with the division between East and West, where Western memorials, first of all around, throughout Germany, their main audience are Germans. There aren't very many Jews to go to these memorials. That's not their primary audience. But Germany is a pretty tenuous place after the war, and they're both actually, they're economically struggling. They have real challenges domestically, and figuring out how to manage memory is going to be part of dealing with their economic challenges and their political challenges and so on. East German memorial sites during the communist era tended to emphasize the Nazis' attack on communists as a political victim group, and they tended to emphasize communist heroism in beating back the Nazis and resisting the Nazis. They didn't tend to say very much, if anything, about Jews. Western memorials tended to say a great deal about Jews. It's kind of a liberal state where notions like freedom of religion, lack of racial persecution, that kind of individual rights is very important. And so this business of persecution on the grounds of race or religion is central to post-war West Germany's reconstitution of itself. So there's an enormous emphasis there on persecution of the Jews, but they're not going to talk very much about heroic communists because this is West Germany and the Cold War is on. So communists are completely invisible from that story. And of course, after the end of the Cold War, all of that has to get rethought. If you take yourself to a place like Poland, okay, there you don't really have to think so much about perpetrators, or at least in terms of speaking to your population. The population there is largely ethnic Poles who themselves were very, very much victimized by Nazi military aggression. At the same time, Poland was the geographic location of the death camps. So there's a special, so the sites like Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor are in Poland. So they end up with this need to talk about the Jewish losses and persecution of the Jews at the same time their own population, in fact, was terribly victimized by the war, both by the Soviets and by the Nazis. So again, a different kind of memorialization through museums and monuments is going to grow up in a culture, in a place like that. I could go on and on. You know, think about Israel, the United States, England, France. Every place has its own story and its own post-war population to talk to.
Yeah. Well, in a place like France, where there was such a division between the Vichy government and the Free French, what do they do? And what was that history like just after the end of the war? I know that may not be your specialty area, but...
Well, in France, what was most important was to identify as part of the resistance, okay? Because France was largely occupied. Part of it was occupied, part of it was a collaborationist state. Eventually, it was all occupied. And France didn't have much to be proud of in terms of its military performance in the war. They folded in 6 weeks. So this notion of the French resistance becomes very, very important to how the post-war French think about it. And there's very little talk about the fact that, in fact, France is full of collaborators as well. Of course, it is a collaborationist state, and they are, you know, French policing is responsible for sending a lot of Jews further east to death camps, but this is not a helpful way to formulate a positive post-war French national identity. So that's very hard to talk about, and it's only several decades later that the French come to those discussions about their own collaborationist past.
Wow. So, you know, this is all still fairly fresh for many of us in this room, many people watching this program, going back, I guess, 70 years, isn't it, to the end of the war. That still feels like fairly fresh memory. 100 years on from now, do you think historians and those studying history will see the events of this period with the same kind of shock and horror and terror that we do? Or, I mean, you never know what will come next. God knows. We could face even worse things, and some may think we are now. But, you know, as time goes on, are some of these horrible episodes in history sort of forgotten?
They absolutely are. Absolutely are. And the Holocaust is not likely to be forgotten simply because in the meantime, so much documentation has been made and so much culture has been produced around it. It's not going to be forgotten. But certainly the immediacy of it is going to change. You know, you can turn back several centuries and think of, let's say, you know, massacres from, let's say, the era of the Crusades that were completely, you know, gut-wrenching, and nobody 20, 30, 40, 50 years later could possibly think about them with anything but horror, and we don't even know about them anymore. So, you know, as the immediacy fades and people face other crises in their life and they face new atrocities that do seem more immediate, people turn their attention to what's most immediate and most pressing. So these things do get rethought and re-remembered in different ways.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. So wonderful to talk with you about this. You've been listening to Lisa Heineman, and this is the third part of our series on cultural memory and commemoration. And glad you could join us for this talk this afternoon. Unfortunately, we do have to end this segment, but I want to remind you that WorldCanvass programming is available on UITV, YouTube, iTunes, KRUI, and the International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. We have one more program in this series where we'll be talking about alternative histories and counter memorials. We hope you can join us for that. I'm Joan Kjaer. Thanks very much for watching.